Okay, I got to tell you, as I stand here right now, I am convicted. Terribly convicted. Because I'm standing here, and I know, because of what we're about to talk about, that I need to be sitting out there, listening to this sermon. Because I really need to hear this sermon. I mean, I'll tell you, my hope has been that by the time we get through today, maybe it'll be 2 o'clock by the time we're finished, depending on how long this sermon goes. But I've been hoping that by the time we're finished today, I'll be a lot better off at the end of all of this than I was when I woke up this morning, because I will have experienced this sermon 3 times. And I need to hear this sermon. It's why I'm so convicted by standing up here when I really ought to be sitting out there. So maybe I should just say this. Today, I'm a student teacher. Needing to hear this as much as you're needing to hear it. Or as D.T. Miles said a long time ago, I'm just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. That's what's going on today. So I was thinking about what we're talking about simplicity. And I was trying to find a person in the Bible that had to deal with this in a profound way. And there's one person in particular that Jesus really zeroed in on with respect to this issue of simplicity. There's one person. She was a very close friend of his. Her name was Martha. Now, Jesus spent a lot of time with his disciples. In fact, he literally poured himself into those 12 disciples. They went everywhere together for a 3-year period of time. But then there were 3 siblings that Daniel talked about a little earlier in the children's sermon. There were 3 siblings that Jesus developed a very special relationship with. Their names were Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And the 3 of them lived in a little village just outside of Jerusalem called Bethany. It's still there today. And at Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house, they had a guest room that Jesus would oftentimes make use of. I mean, you can imagine what life must have been like for Jesus. Especially the more people began to hear about him and get to know about some of the things that Jesus was doing. I mean, it was almost as if the more teaching that he led, the more healings he performed, the more miracles that were worked through his hands, the more people sought after him. And so he would oftentimes just get overwhelmed with it all and need to stop and unplug and go and spend some time at Mary and Martha and Lazarus' guest room. And just as my kids will say, hang out with his friends for a while and just recharge. Well, so one day Jesus made one of these stops at their house. And Luke talks about it in the 10th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And listen to what Luke writes about this visit that Jesus made one day to their house. This is in Luke 10, beginning in verse 38. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha, bless her heart, that's what my Bible actually has that in there. But Martha, bless her heart, was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to Jesus and she asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all this work by myself? Tell her then to help me. But Jesus answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There's really need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Now, I got to tell you, it doesn't take being a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on in this story. I mean, obviously, Jesus did not text Mary and Martha and tell them that he was coming by to stop at their house for a while. He didn't let them know. He just sort of stopped by because, he knew that that's what friends can do. Friends can stop at a friend's house unannounced because they just want to spend time with their friends. And so that's what Jesus did. And I can imagine that Jesus got to their house that day, he walked through the door and walked into the living room and sat down in his favorite spot in the house. That spot where he could just sit and sort of see everything that was going on and just relax. And so I like to think Jesus walked in, sat down there, and then Mary comes, pulls up a chair, and sits next to him and starts to visit. Now, I don't know what happened during their visit. Maybe Mary asked Jesus about what he had done during the course of that particular day. I don't know. Maybe she asked him how he was dealing with the Pharisees. I mean, can you imagine what that must have been like for Jesus? To have to constantly be combating this group of church leaders who were constantly coming after him, trying to downplay the things that he said, trying to prove him wrong. I mean, so maybe she asked him about how he was doing, handling that. Maybe she just asked him about him. Maybe she pulled a John Wesley and looked Jesus in the eye and said, "How is it with your soul today?" I don't know. All I do know is that Jesus walked into their house, he sat down, Mary pulled up a chair, and they began to visit. And while Jesus and Mary are catching up in the living room, Martha, in the meantime, is scurrying around the kitchen, trying to get something together to show good hospitality to Jesus. I mean, she knew that he was tired. She knew that he was probably hungry and thirsty. And so she's trying to get together a little plate of snack food so that he could tide himself over until dinner. And she was probably pouring him something to drink and then looking through the stuff that she had stored up so that she could put together a nice meal for him later that evening. And she's doing all this scurrying around, trying to do her Martha Stewart thing. And then I imagine there came a point where she realized, hey, I'm the only one doing something. And she went and she looked in the living room and she saw Mary just sitting down there talking to Jesus. And this ticked her off. And so I don't know exactly what happened in the story, but I mean, I can imagine that she decides at that point that she's going to try to get her sister's attention. So maybe she started dropping some hints. You know, like... And if that didn't work, maybe she dropped a pan in the kitchen, you know, make a lot of noise. Just drop. Maybe she stumbled over that pan, you know, and let out a little word just to let her sister know that she was not very happy with her. I don't know. Maybe she found a way to kind of sneak into the living room and catch her sister's eye so that she could give her the eye. How many of you have ever gotten that eye? You know, it's that eye that says, would you get off of your rear end and get in here and help me? I don't know exactly what she did to try to get her sister's attention, but I do know that at some point, Martha had it up to here. And I've never quite figured out what exactly that means. But she did. She had it up to here. She was done with all of this. And so she barged into the living room and she didn't even talk to her sister. She went straight to Jesus and she said, "Lord, don't you care?" Now, it's kind of interesting to think about her asking that question to that man. Don't you care? I mean, this was the Lord of the universe that she's talking to here. Don't you care? This was the one who left heaven and put on human flesh and came and lived and walked on this earth. Lord, don't you care? This is the guy who in just a matter of weeks is going to surrender his body to be tortured and beaten and whipped. This is the one who in just a couple of weeks is going to bleed and die for everyone on the planet, including her. And so she says, "Lord, don't you care?" Can you see her in the kitchen? I mean, I got a picture of her that she's probably standing there with an apron around her waist. She's got a wooden spoon in one hand, and her other hand is on her hip. "Lord, don't you care?" And she points that spoon at her sister. Don't you care that my sister has made me do all this all by myself? Would you? And she doesn't even move around. Would you tell her to help me? And I love Jesus' response. He does not come back at her with the same kind of fury that she has just interjected into that living room, nor did he tell her what she could do with that spoon. No, Luke tells us that Jesus just speaks her name twice. Martha, Martha. Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. He can tell what's going on with her. He can tell that she's a lot like us. You're worried and distracted by many things. Can you relate? Can you relate? And then Jesus says, Martha, there's need of only one thing. Only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and I'm not going to take it away from her. One thing. I like how Bill Hybels sums this up. He says, I picture Jesus clarifying the lines in this moment, taking advantage of a teachable moment for everyone in the room. Martha, can I simplify something for you here? Whenever I stop by, it's not for the food. I mean, if I wanted a 5-star dinner, I could arrange for one. Don't forget, I fed 5,000 people just a couple of weeks ago. And I made some awesome Chardonnay at a wedding reception once. I can arrange for food and drink anywhere, anytime. So when I stop by to visit, it's for friendship. It's for connection. It's to be with you. I come here for the life-giving, life-exchanging engagement, for fellowship. That's all, really. There is really only one thing that's needful. I forget that a lot. Don't you? Because I'm a lot like Martha. I mean, I get worried and I get distracted by a whole lot of junk that I think is hugely important. And I know what's really important. I mean, I know that. I've been told by a therapist. I've been told by my wife. I know. I've been told by a group of pastors that I was in a accountability group with a few years ago. I mean, I know my grandfather, who was a pastor for over 60 years, he told me when he was alive what's important. I mean, I know. But I still get worried and distracted by a lot of stuff. And the result is I end up becoming one of those words around this room. How many of you are here this morning and one of those words applies to you? Several years ago, I was introduced to a book that, quite honestly, I could have written myself after I read it. It's a book written by Wayne Cordero. He's the pastor of New Hope Community Church. It's a mega church in Honolulu, Hawaii. And he wrote a book entitled Leading on Empty. And in this book, he gives a personal testimony about his survival from severe burnout. And he begins his book this way in chapter 1. He says, not long ago, I was asked to meet with 24 of our nation's brightest and best emerging leaders. He said, the men who gathered here were all around 40 years old, and they had congregations, each of them were more than 3,000 members in size. He said, on the second day, conference organizers asked these young leaders a question that caught many of them, myself included, off guard. The question they asked them was, what do you fear the most? Cordero says, as they each took a turn answering, tears began to flow freely, and several could not even finish their sentences. One admitted that he didn't know how much longer his marriage could sustain the pressure. But it was another leader's answer that grabbed my attention. Cordero says, his greatest fear? I just don't want my kids growing up hating God because of me. Observing the lives of many of these 40-something leaders, Cordero says, I saw the unmistakable signs of burnout already emerging. And then he wrote this about himself. He said, as a senior pastor, my life was bookended with weekend services. I had developed the discipline of image management. Can you say Facebook? But on the inside, I was experiencing a slow motion implosion. I knew others loved me, but living up to the expectations systemically ingrained into the fabric of who I was became the person I could not escape. Can you just hear Jesus saying, Wayne, Jim, Susan, Linda, you are worried and distracted by too many things. There is need of only one thing. One thing. Let me ask you something. Do you think that spending time with Jesus, some unhurried, unrushed time with Jesus, is what you need to combat the busyness and the drivenness in your life? Do you believe that's what you need? Now, I know some of that busyness, some of that drivenness is necessary. Some of that busyness, some of that drivenness, God wired into you because He called you to a certain way of life that requires some of that. Which is why I don't think it's accidental that Luke leads into this living room scene with Mary and Martha and Jesus by telling the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know that story, right? Jesus told that parable of the Good Samaritan to teach His disciples about the importance of helping those who are in need. It was Jesus' way of teaching the disciples and encouraging Christian activism to answer the call of the gospel, to lift up the downtrodden, to heal the broken, and to restore those who have been put down. I mean, that's what Jesus was trying to do by telling that parable of the Good Samaritan. But then Luke tells about what happens with Martha and her own activism. And I believe by putting these together side by side is Jesus' way of saying, in your activism, which some of it may be incredibly necessary, but in your activism, don't lose sight of the fact that the fundamental thing that I'm looking for from my followers is relationship. Unrushed, unhurried, sit down and spend some time with me, relationship. Maybe Jesus is wanting to say to you, as He said to Martha that day, whenever I come here, I come for a visit, and I come for one thing, and that's the exchange of love. It's the exchange of conversation. It's having some unrushed conversation with me. Because when we're together, we're going to talk about how great the Father is. We're going to talk about how much He loves you. Now, I have a hunch that some of you came here today when you heard about what I was going to be preaching about. I have a hunch that some of you came here today hoping that you would get some pithy little anecdotal example of how you can do away with all the busyness and clutter in your life and claim some simplicity. Maybe you were hoping for some steps to take to get there. Well, I'm not going to give you a bunch of steps. But let me ask you this. Do you agree that the solution to Martha's anxiety that day was to stop all of her busyness and just pull up a chair and spend some time with Jesus? Do you believe that that is what she needed? Do you believe that there's that much power in spending time with Him? I'll tell you how it is for me. The time that I've spent in the Bible during this journey that we've been on since the first of the year, taking the Bible in 90 days, has been an amazing journey for me. I mean, the time that I have spent reading the Bible has been rich. And I can't tell you how many times it's happened where I've, it's literally changed the way I've approached my days. But I do have to tell you that I'm a week behind in my reading at this point. I got sick about 10 days ago, and I couldn't think, I couldn't do anything while I was sick, so I didn't read during those days. And yet before that, I was reading every day. And every time I would read, something would happen during the course of my time with God and with His Word, that I would read something and a truth would come out of whatever I was reading that day, and it would just lodge itself in my mind. And then the day would begin to unfold, and there would come a point, and it happened almost every day, there would come a point where something would happen. I would be in a conversation with another person, or an issue would come up, and that conversation or the issue would cause that truth that had lodged in my brain to just bubble up to the surface and speak into that situation beautiful words. And it was a wonderful thing. But then I got sick, and then I got behind, and I don't like being behind. And just being behind caused stress for me. And then I came back to work, and I was not only behind in reading the Bible in 9 days, but I was behind in my work. And there have been several days recently where I just haven't read at all. And I got to tell you what happened. In those days, my day crashed in. It just crashed in, and stuff started happening, and before long, I got very easily worried and distracted by a lot of things. And I could tell the difference. One of the things I read about a week or so ago, we were reading through Ecclesiastes, and I was reading about how Solomon testified in Ecclesiastes to the fact that he had, through the course of his life, gained all kinds of wealth, more wealth than anybody could ever imagine gaining. And he'd accumulated wisdom, just wisdom beyond measure, and all the worldly possessions anybody could ever hope to have, he possessed. And he looked at all of that in his life, and he came to this conclusion. That all that he had accumulated, all that he had done was just chasing the wind. And it was meaningless. And I was thinking about this message today, and I wondered if Jesus had been in the room with Solomon when he was writing those words in Ecclesiastes. I think Jesus would have said, "Hey, Solomon, pull up a chair and listen to me. You're too worried and distracted by many things. One thing is needful. Just one thing." This past week, I was looking through some of the books that I have that were written by Billy Graham as I've reflected on his life since his death this week. And I just wanted to be reminded of his heart for ministry and his heart for the Lord. And the next to last book he wrote in 2013. It's a book entitled "The Reason for My Hope." And that book is a book about salvation. And at the end of that book, Billy Graham talks about how much he enjoyed spending time on college campuses and talking to college students. And he tells about one day when he was on a college campus, and a student came up to him and said, "Mr. Graham, we hear a lot about what Christ has done for us, about the value of religion and about what personal salvation is. But nobody tells us how to find Christ." And so Billy Graham spends the final pages of this book on salvation telling us how to find Christ. And I was amazed at the first thing he said. He said, "First, you must be convinced that you need Him. If you feel that you are self-sufficient, if you feel that you are capable of meeting life head on and under your own power, then you will never find Him. Never. One thing. I need Jesus. You need Jesus. I mean, Jesus himself said in Matthew 11:28, he said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." I think when Eugene Peterson wrote the Message translation of this verse, he was thinking about this sermon today, because he interpreted it like this: Are you tired? Are you worn out? Burned out? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. One thing. Maybe you're here this morning and you've been pushing and you've been pushing and you've been pushing, and your tank is empty. And you've been running on empty for a long time. Please hear me right now. If this story in Luke's gospel tells us anything, it ought to tell you that you need to pay attention to what you put in your tank when it's empty. Because I'm going to tell you, when you get tired, when you get stressed out, when you get worn down, it is very, very easy to put the wrong stuff in your tank to try to fill yourself up. Some of us, when we discover that our tank is empty, we shift into overdrive. We just start pushing. We just start pushing, and our energy is fueled by the adrenaline that sort of begins pumping in our brains as we start spinning plates just to try to get through all the stuff that we need to get done. Some of us are energized by that. And we use those kinds of situations to fill our tanks. Some of us try to fill our tanks and we get sucked into TV. Or I know adults who get sucked into gaming to try to fill their tanks. Or some of us get sucked into destructive and dark addictive behaviors, like pornography. Some of us, to try to fill the emptiness, fill our tanks with inappropriate relationships. Some of us, when our tanks get empty and we run on empty for long enough, we become so self-focused that we can't see anything beyond ourselves. I tell you this to warn you that running on empty, getting worried and distracted by too many things for too long, I'm going to tell you, no matter how good you think you are, no matter how smart you think you are, no matter how tough you think you might be, there will come a point where you will crash. Because you will discover that you have spent your time trying to fill your tank with all the wrong things. There is one thing that you need. One thing. And it can never be taken away from you. And that is Jesus. Every day, follow Mary's example. Pull up a chair and spend some time with Jesus. There's a picture I want to show you that I think captures this best. Maybe you've seen this picture a time or two. You recognize that? Michelangelo painted that on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The hand on the left is God's hand. The hand on the right is the hand of the one he created. And as I think about that painting, I think about our greatest need. Our greatest need is for our hand to make that 6-inch journey and take hold of his. Because I'm going to tell you, when I'm holding God's hand, there is nothing that can get me down. When I'm holding tightly to God's hand, I possess a freedom and a passion for life and ministry that I cannot nor will I ever be able to get when I'm freewheeling it and just doing it on my own. And the time I spend with Jesus, pulling up a chair next to him and spending time with him, gives Jesus a chance to remind me of God's great love for me and of my desperate need to reach out and take hold of the Father's hand. One thing is needful. I want to invite you in these days ahead to think about what needs to shift in your life. Think about all those things that you feel like are so important. And consider the one thing that you really need. What would it take for you to make some time, some chair time with Jesus? What would it take? Let us pray.